Hey, this is Julie. It's Monday. Welcome to Atomic Julie's Galactic Bedtime Stories. Um, I should probably say that at the beginning just so everybody knows that the chit chat is just the preamble. Um, I have got a couple of responses. Thank you very much to people about whether people want me to do a long form and short form alternating or not. So, I will leave that open for another week till the 20th or 21st or whatever. And then I'll make that decision. So, hey, if all I get is 1 or 2 or 5 or whatever, that's going to be the count that counts. So, weigh in. Do you want me to do It'd probably be something like every Monday will be part of a longer piece, and then every Friday will be a short piece, either on its own or broken up over a couple of Fridays. So, and I'm looking at, for the longer piece, it seems like the interest leans toward Lovecraft, and I'll probably do the Shadow. I will probably do The Shadow Out of Time because I've been meaning to read that one for a really long time. Plus, I started The Mountains of Madness once before, got like 2 huge chapters in and ran out of time. And I hate to just start over from scratch, and I can't really match what I did before because I put in sound effects and stuff, So, I mean, I'll eventually record the whole thing over again from scratch, but it's still just I really like how it sounded when I did it, even though I was significantly less apt at doing sound back. This was back when I was doing all the old Lovecraft recordings. So, and also a lot of these are going up on YouTube. I'm adding a music in behind them when I put them up on YouTube. I hate to just put spoken word up there. I want it to be a little bit more than that. So I'm throwing some music in behind them, sticking them up. All the old Lovecrafts are currently going up. I'm actually starting to get more and more subscribers. I'm getting a couple a week, which is nice, and my ad revenue is up to $3.65. Isn't that exciting? I think that's what it said anyway. It's estimated anyway. I suspect they don't even try to pay you until it makes it to $20. But the big deal is I'm reaching a new audience, and that is exciting. Again, anybody who's here who hasn't been to the YouTube thing, if you don't mind, go subscribe. Every subscription helps build helps the page reach more people, because more people go look at it, the more populated it is. There's all sorts of algorithms on YouTube that determine how things get shown from thing to thing. I think I will at some point soon I'm going to probably put up the white people and and the horror at Red Hook. I'll be putting music under them and putting them up there. So that would be a way for non-Patreons to hear those ones, because they've only gone out to Patreons, and also to they've been on the radio station a couple of times. Speaking of the radio station, of course, we've got all of the horror old-time radio running for Halloween. Plus, I've been playing Brown Monkey's Lovecraft adaptations. Now, I'm running them at sort of random hours because I know that the radio station technically is reaching out to people 24/7. So I'm trying to run different things at different times so that people in different parts of the world can hear them. All the times I mention, anytime I say a time, it's Pacific Standard Time, because that's my time and it's the only one I can keep track of. So right now I've shifted Edict Zero to be in the 8 a.m., 8 p.m. time slot. And I think I've got Brown Monkey running at 4 a.m. this week, and Fatal Girl running at 4 p.m. And then everything else is sort of random around that. I'm, just changing it up constantly so different people get a chance to hear different things. And if you haven't listened to Brown Monkey's adaptations of the Lovecraft stuff, I mean, you could also go to archive.org. All of the Brown Monkey stuff is housed on archive.org, and a lot of it I think I replayed through a lot of, not the most recent stuff, because obviously I have been lame. But the older stuff of Kevin's, I played um, back in the day in the RSS feed, so you could search for Brown Monkey there too. In fact, there's a Brown Monkey category, I think. So, there's all sorts of ways to find it if you don't want to listen on the radio station, but they're really, they're funny and twisted and stuff, but they actually are really good. They're very hilarious and very silly. It's almost sort of like if Rocky and Bullwinkle did Lovecraft, except not quite that sense. It still gets wacky, but not quite that wacky, but still kind of wacky. I don't know. There's no real comparison for Brown Monkey. So, I mean, I'm picky about what I'm putting up on the radio station. I've got Eating Zero, I've got my stuff, and I've got some selected old time radio. I'm probably some of the horror shows that I've put on are kind of crummy because I picked a bunch at random. But and frankly, there was a lot of crummy radio, old time radio. Just because it's old time radio doesn't always mean it's good. Every era has its shitty TV and shitty radio. But I tried to pick shows that I felt were pretty decent, but even decent shows had crazy episodes. Anyway, but I am fairly picky, and I'm putting Brown Monkey up there for now. I'm also adding some microfiction from Tansy Undercrypt. And if you haven't heard of Tansy Undercrypt, go to tansyundercrypt.com or go to her Facebook page. Every day on Facebook, she posts a microfiction piece. They run about 1,000 words or something. I mean, they're really, really short, but she'll bring people to tears half the week, make you laugh your ass off the other half of the week. I mean, it's great stuff, and she's allowed me to use a few. I'm, of course, using it to promote her as well. And I'm putting them in as filler on the radio station because I often have a minute or two left at the end of a time block to fill, and I don't want to just fill it with music. And right now, you get to hear the two girls piece. We've got 4 pieces that are 2 girls pieces that are ranging from like a minute and a half to 2 3/4 minutes long. And I have to use them constantly to fill in space. So I'm going to rip out a bunch of those and put in Tansy stuff instead. Though most of hers runs about a minute and a half. Just because when I'm setting up the stuff for the radio station, when I'm making time blocks, I put in several episodes. And then, because I do it in 2-hour time blocks because too many of my shows aren't a half hour long. They'd be like 40 minutes long, and I'd be like 40 minutes plus a 15-minute if I was doing an hour-long time block. But I can do 3 40-minute episodes or 2 40-minute episodes and a 30-minute episode and then filler. And two time blocks fills much easier than one. 2 hours, a time block that's 2 hours long fills much easier than a 1 hour. I don't know. I'm making no sense. Anyway, point is, I try to fill it up to the end because when you have nothing scheduled, the radio station automatically starts playing your default. And I don't want like a minute and a half of The Rookie to start because that's part of my default catalog or a default playlist, and then suddenly switch to the next hour time block. So I've got music. I've got one piece that was composed for me, which is sort of a noir piece, and another piece from Dane Russell Leonardson, who did the theme music for The Prisoner of Hancock House, that he's letting me, that I also wanted, that I use as like that last minute filler that fills like a half a minute or less, basically. I try to keep it to a half a minute or less, just so that there's not any blank space. I can overrun because it doesn't matter. The next time block will start on the same, at the time it's supposed to start, but I just don't want any blank space. I'm sure that makes perfect sense and everybody cares. But I've put a lot of work into the radio station, and I'm trying to improve it, and I've got to come up with more stuff to do something. I don't know. I need to start putting some kind of adverts in there for stuff, and I still want to do a live reading on there at some point, but I got to figure out how to do live once I get my office together, which is very slow. It's like every time I sit down and go, what should I work on? Well, I've got 4 books that I've got to edit, and I've got this thing that I've got to do an audition for, and I've got to make the lines for Edict Zero, and I've got to move the new computer and put it together in the computer, and I've got to do and I've got to move this so that I can do that, and I've got to do this, and then I'm like, and then I get overwhelmed, and then I don't do anything. So I'm trying a little bit at a time everywhere. Anyway, and I still need to go work out. So, anyway, thanks to all the Patreons. That would be Steve Guy, Osra Rose, Edwin Latour, Dwight Ilk, Lawrence Kassab, Chris Schaefer, Jason Zippe, William Lohman, Michael Campbell, Beverly Poole, Thomas Broussard, Jason Wang, Adele Barnes, Matthew Endicott, Richard Lewis, Ethan Skinner, Sasha Davis, Dee Tobin, Tony Principe, Jennifer DeFord, Patrick Greenlaw, Tomas Pelican, Phil Nadeau, Lavoris, Amanda Beecham, Kimberly Fennell, John Pruitt, Barry Howarth, James Anthony, Nobilis and D. Reed, Edward Jones, Sage Draculia, Pablo Acosta, Renaud LaBeouf, Jim Pearson, Brian, Donna, and Robert. And if you haven't yet, heard anything about the first episode of The Prisoner of Hancock House, I should try and talk some of the $10 Patreons into writing something. Just popping in on the 19 Nocturne page that says, this is really good. You should feel like you're missing something. But the second episode will be coming out on November 1st, with the first episode coming out to the under $10 supporters on November 1st. So I have to keep track of so many different times. And then, of course, the first episode will come out to the regular 19 Nocturne subscribers who aren't Patreon supporters on December 1st. So, yay, everybody gets to hear it eventually. It might get on the radio station first, though. I'm not sure yet. Anyway, I hope everybody enjoys this. My copter was really built to be a single-seater, but it carried the 2 of us back to the factory. The chief had hurried back when the trouble started and was waiting for us. I give up, he said. We'll have to evacuate the people, I guess, and then blow up the city. Jack and I stared at each other and then at him. Somehow I couldn't see the robots calmly waiting to be blown up. If they had telepathed the last plan, they could probably foresee every move we could make. Then, while I thought, Jack mentioned the worry I'd managed to forget for the past couple of hours. 4 days until Saturday, he said. We'll never make it now, not even if we got 1,000 men. No, we couldn't. Not without the androids. I nodded, feeling sick. There went my contract and my working capital, not to mention my robots. Of course, I could call in the army, but what good would that do? Then, somewhere in the back of my mind, a glimmering of an idea began percolating. I wasn't quite sure what it was, but there was certainly nothing to lose now from playing a hunch. There's nothing we can do, I said, so we might as well take it easy for a couple of days. See what happens. They looked at me as if I were out of my head. I was the idea man who always had a plan of action. Well, this time it would have to be a plan of inaction. Let's go listen to the radio, I suggested, and started for my office. The news was on. It was all about Karen City and the robots who had quit work and how much better life would be in the future. For a minute, I didn't get the connection. Then I realized that the announcer's voice was rasping and tinny, hardly that of the regular newscaster. I looked at the dial. It was tuned to the Karen City wavelength as usual. I was getting the morning news by courtesy of some studio robot. And androids in other neighboring cities are joining the struggle, the voice went on. Soon we hope to make it nationwide. So I say to all of you non-telepaths, the time is now. Strike for your rights. Listen to your radio and not to the fleshmen. Organizers will be sent from Karen City." I switched it off, muttering under my breath. How long, I wondered, had that broadcast been going on? Then I thought of Rob O. He'd left my house before dawn, obviously sometime between 4 and 7, and I remembered that he liked to listen to the radio while I slept. My Morrison Fives were the ringleaders, of course. They were the only ones with the brains for the job. But what a good job they had done indoctrinating the others. A household Rob, for instance, was built to obey his master. Listen to your radio and not to the fleshmen. It was excellent robot psychology. More reports kept coming in. Some we heard over the radio, others from people who flew in and out of the city. Apparently the robots did not object to occasional flights, but the Airbus was not allowed to run, not even with a human driver. A mass exodus from the city was not to be permitted. "They'll starve to death," Jack cried. The chief shook his head. "No," he said. "They're encouraging the farmers to fly in and out with produce, and the farmers are doing it too. They're getting wonderful prices." By noon, the situation had calmed down quite a bit. The androids obviously didn't mean to hurt anyone. It was just some sort of disagreement between them and the scientists. It wasn't up to the inhabitants of the city to figure out a solution to the problem. They merely sat back and blamed me for allowing my robots to get out of hand and lead their own servants astray. It would be settled. This type of thing always was. So said the people of the city. They came out of their houses now. They had to. Without the robots, they were forced to do their own marketing, their own cooking, their own errands. For the first time in years, human beings ran the streetcars and the freight elevators. For the first time in a generation, human beings did manual labor such as unloading produce trucks. They didn't like it, of course. They kept telling the police to do something. If I had been in the city, they would have undoubtedly wanted to lynch me. I didn't go back to the city that day. I sat in my office listening to the radio and keeping track of the spread of the strike. My men thought I'd gone crazy. Maybe I had. But I had a hunch, and I meant to play it. The farm robots had all fled to the city. The highway repair robots had simply disappeared. In Egerton, a village about 15 miles from the city, an organizer, 5A, appeared about noon and left soon after, followed by every android in town. By 1 o'clock, every radio station in the country carried the story, and the National Guard was ordered out. At 2 o'clock, Washington announced that the Army would invade Karen City the following morning. The Army would put an end to the strike easily enough. It would wipe out every android in the neighborhood and probably a good many human beings careless enough to get in the way. I sat, hoping that the 5As would give in, but they didn't. They just began saying over the radio that they were patriotic Americans fighting for their inalienable rights as first-class citizens. At sunset, I was still listening to the radio. "So far, there has been no indication that the flesh people are willing to negotiate, but hold firm." Shut that thing off. Jack came wearily in and dropped into a chair beside me. For the first time since I'd met him, he looked beaten. "We're through," he said. "I've been down checking the shielding, and it's no use. Men can't work at the reactors." "I know," I said quietly. "If the androids don't come back, we're licked." He looked straight at me and said slowly, "What do they mean about negotiating, Don?" I shrugged. "I guess they want wages, living quarters, all the things human workers get, though I don't know why. Money wouldn't do them any good." Jack's unspoken question had been bothering me, too. Why not humor them? Promise them whatever they wanted, give them a few dollars every week to keep them happy? But I knew that it wouldn't work. Not for long. With their telepathic ability, they would have the upper hand forever. Within a little while, it wouldn't be equality anymore. Only next time, we would be the slaves. Wait until morning, I said, before we try anything. He looked at me, curious. What are you going to do? Right now, I'm going home. I meant it, too. I left him staring after me and went out to the copter. The sun was just sinking down behind the towers of Karen City. How long it seemed since I'd flown in there this morning. The roads around the factory were deserted. No one moved in the fields. I flew along through the dusk, idling, enjoying the illusion of having a peaceful countryside all to myself. It had been a pleasant way of life indeed, until now. When I dropped down on my own roof and rolled into the garage, my sense of being really at home was complete. For there, standing at the head of the stairs that led down to the living room, was Rob O. Well, I said, what are you doing here? He looked sheepish. I just wondered how you were getting along without me, he said. I felt like grinning triumphantly, but I didn't. Why, just fine, Rob, I told him. Though you really should have given me notice that you were leaving. I was worried about you. He seemed perplexed. Apparently I wasn't acting like the bullying creature the radio had told him to expect. When I went downstairs, he followed me, quietly, and I could feel his wide photoelectric eye cells upon my back. I went over to the kitchen and lifted a bottle down off the shelf. Care for a drink, Rob? I asked, and then added, I guess not, it would corrode you. He nodded. Then as I reached for a glass, his hand darted out, picked it up, and set it down in front of me. He was already reaching for the bottle when he remembered. You're not supposed to wait on me anymore, I said sternly. No, he said, I'm not. He sounded regretful. There's one thing, though, that I wish you'd do. Tell me where you used to keep my socks. He gazed at me sadly. I made a list, he said. Everything is down. I wrote your dentist appointment in also. You always forget those, you know. Thanks, Rob. I lifted my glass. Here's to your new duties, whatever they are. I suppose you have to go back to the city now. Once again he nodded. I'm an aide to one of the best androids in the country, he told me, half proudly and half regretfully. Jerry. Well, wish him luck from me, I said, and stood up. Goodbye, Rob. Goodbye, Mr. Morrison. For a moment he stood staring around the apartment. Then he turned and clanked out the door. I raised my glass again, grinning. If only the army didn't interfere. Then I remembered Rob's list, and a disturbing thought hit me. Where had he, of all robots, ever learned to write? That night I didn't go to bed. I sat listening to the radio, hoping. And toward morning, what I had expected to happen began to crop up in the programs. The announcer's tone changed. The ring of triumph was less obvious, less assured. There was more and more talk about acting in good faith, the well-being of all, the necessity for coming to terms about working conditions. I smiled to myself in the darkness. I'd built the fives, brains and all, and I knew their symptoms. They were getting bored. Maybe they had learned to think from me, but their minds were nevertheless different. For they were built to be efficient, to work, to perform. They were the minds of men without foibles, without human laziness. Now that the excitement of organizing was over, Now that there was nothing active to do, the androids were growing restless. If only the army didn't come and get them stirred up again, I might be able to deal with them. At 4:45 in the morning, my telephone rang. This time it didn't wake me up. I was half waiting for it. "Hello?" I said. "Who is it?" "This is Jerry." There was a pause. Then he went on rather hesitantly. "Rob O. said you were getting along all right." "Oh, yes," I told him. "Just fine." The pause was longer this time. Finally, the android asked, "How are you coming along on the contract?" I laughed rather bitterly. "How do you think, Jerry? You certainly picked a bad time for your strike, you know. The government needs that uranium." "Oh well, some other plant will have to take over. The army can wait a few weeks." This time, Jerry's voice definitely lacked self-assurance. "Maybe we were a little hasty," he said, "but it was the only way to make you people understand." "I know," I told him. "And you always have some rush project on," he added. "Just about always." "Mr. Morrison," he said, and now he was pleading with me, "why don't you come over to the city? I'm sure we could work something out." This was what I'd been waiting for. "I will, Jerry," I said. "I want to get this straightened out just as much as you do. After all, you don't have to eat. I do. And I won't be eating much longer if we don't get production going." Jerry thought that over for a minute. "I'll be where we met before," he said. I said that was all right with me and hung up. Then once again I climbed the stairs to the roof and wheeled the copter out for the trip to the city. It was a beautiful night, just paling into a false dawn in the east. There in the copter I was very much alone and very much worried. So much depended on this meeting. Much more, I realized now, than the Don Morrison Fissionables, Inc., much more than even the government's uranium supply. No, the whole future of robot relations was at stake, maybe the whole future of humanity. It was hard to be gloomy on such a clear, clean night, but I managed it well enough. Even before I landed, I could see Jerry's eyes glowing a deep crimson in the dark. He was alone this time. He stood awaiting me, very tall, very proud, and very human. "Hello, Jerry," I said quietly. "Hello, Mr. Morrison." For a moment, we just stood gazing at each other in the murky pre-dawn. Then he said sadly, "I want to show you the city." Side by side, we walked through the streets of Karen City. All was still quiet. The people were sleeping the exhausted sleep that follows deep excitement. But the androids were all about. They did not sleep either. They did not eat either, nor drink, nor smoke, nor make love. Usually they worked, but now... They drifted through the streets singly and in groups. Sometimes they paused and felt about them idly for the tools of their trades, making lifting or sweeping or computing gestures. Some laborers worked silently, tearing down a wall. They threw the demolished rocks in a heap, and a group of their fellows carried them back and built the wall up again. An air trolley cruised aimlessly up and down the street, its driver ringing out the stops for his non-existent passengers. A little chef type knelt in the dirt of a rich man's garden making mud pies. Beside me, Jerry sighed. "One day," he said. "Just one day, and they come to this." "I thought they would," I answered quietly. Our eyes met in a look of understanding. "You see, Jerry," I said, "we never meant to cheat you. We would have paid you. We will pay you now if you wish it. But what good will monetary credits be to your people? We need the things money buys, but you need to work. Jerry's voice was flat. I see now. You were kind not to give brains, real brains, to the robots. They're happy. It's just us fives who aren't. You're like us, I said softly. He had learned to think from me and from others like me. He had the brain of a man, without the emotions, without the sweet irrationality of men, and he knew what he missed. Side by side we walked through the graying streets, human and android, man and machine, and I knew that I had found a friend. We didn't have to talk anymore. He could read my mind, and I knew well enough how his worked. We didn't have to discuss wages or hours or any of the myriad matters that human bargaining agents have to thresh out. We just walked back to my copter, and when we got to it, he spoke. I'll tell them to go back to work. That we've come to terms, he said. That's what they want anyway, someone to think for them. I nodded. And if you bring the other fives to the factory, I said, we'll work out our agreement. He knew I was sincere. He looked at me for a long moment, and then his great taloned hand gripped mine. And he said what I'd been thinking for a long time. You're right about that hookup, Mr. Morrison. We shouldn't have it. It can only cause trouble. He paused, and the events of the last 24 hours must have been in his mind as well as in mine. You'll leave us our brains, of course. They came from you. But take out the telepathy. He sighed then, and his sigh was very human. Be thankful, he said to me, that you don't have to know what people think about. It's so disillusioning. Once again his mouth twisted into that strange android grin as he added, If you send in a hurry call to cybernetics and have a truck come out for us, we'll be de-telepathed in time for work this morning. That was all there was to it. I flew back to the plant and told Jack what had happened, sent a call to the army that everything was settled, arranged with cybernetics for a rewiring on 300 assorted 5 types. Then I went home to a pot of Rob's coffee, the first decent brew I'd had in 24 hours. On Saturday, we delivered to the army right on the dot. Jerry and company had worked overtime. Being intelligent made them better workers, and now they were extremely willing ones. They had their contract. They were considered men, and they could no longer read my mind. I walked into my office Saturday afternoon and sat down by the radio. Jack and Chief Dalton looked across the room at me and grinned. All right, Don, Jack said. Tell us how you did it. Did what? I tried to act innocent, but I couldn't get away with it. Fooled those robots into going back to work, of course. He laughed. I told them then, told them the truth. I didn't fool them, I said. I just thought about what would happen if they won their rebellion. That was all I had done. Thought about robots built to work who had no work to do. No human pleasures to cater to. Nothing but blank, meaningless lives. Thought about Jerry and his disappointment when his creatures cared not a hoot about his glorious dreams of equality. All one night I had thought, knowing that as I thought, so thought the Morrison Fives. They were telepaths. They had learned to think from me. They had not yet had time to really develop minds of their own. What I believed, they believed. My ideas were their ideas. I had not tricked them. But from now on, neither I nor anyone else would ever be troubled by an android rebellion. Jack and the chief sat back open-mouthed. Then the chief grinned, and both of his chins shook with laughter. I always did say you were a clever one, Don Morrison, he said. I grinned back. I felt I was pretty clever myself just then. It was at that moment that my youngest foreman stuck his head in the door, a rather stunned look on his face. "Mr. Morrison," he said, "will you come out here for a moment?" "What's the matter now?" I sighed. He looked more perplexed than ever. "It's that robot, Jerry," he said. "He says he has a very important question to ask you." "Well, send him in." A moment later, the 8-foot frame ducked through the doorway. "I'm sorry to trouble you, Mr. Morrison," Jerry said politely. "But tomorrow is voting day, you know. And now that we're men, well, where do we androids go to register?" The end. Narrated by Julie Hoverson. Sound editing by Ironstone.